better?
It's always good.
Okay.
Sometimes it's just a little gooder.
Okay. Namaste.
Namaste.
Have I told you the story, by the way, speaking of ringing the bell, about Natalie Goldberg? Natalie Goldberg is, she wrote a book in the 80s, it's actually very good, called Writing Down the Bones. She's a writer, and she's also a Zen practitioner. And she decided she would teach her parents, who are retired in Florida because that's the law, how to meditate. And so they sat there, and she just had them meditate quietly for a few minutes, and they got done, and she said, well, what'd you think? And her father was basically like, well, it's just like sitting in the kitchen, what's the big deal? And can we try it again, and can I ring the bell? So she figured he was getting into it, foolishly, gave him the bell, which he started repeatedly ringing while he's saying, won't you come home, Bill Bailey? So every time somebody complains about the bell, I think, well, it could be worse.
Yeah. Oh, wow. How did you hear that story?
She tells it.
Oh.
Natalie Goldberg tells it.
That's funny. Excuse me, I'm sorry, please.
No, that's all right. Get yourself some tea. I'll just talk.
Okay.
So today we're talking about rhymes, not things that rhymes, but rhymes, because everybody needs an acronym. And at one point in my teaching, I became very jealous because I didn't have an acronym. And other people have acronyms, and I'm one of these people that spends a lot of his time making up funny meanings for other people's acronyms, you know, changing the words so that it doesn't come out like they want it to. And so what I wondered was, could you come up with an acronym that explained what interspirituality was from at least my understanding and perspective? And what I came up with was Rhimes. And it's R-H-I-M-E-S, because if you spell it correctly, then what happens is when somebody Googles it, they get all this stuff about words that rhyme. And you don't want somebody to get all this stuff about words that rhyme. You want them to find your acronym. So now they find me and Leanne Rhimes. And it's pretty easy to tell us apart, you know, because she's 6 feet tall and skinny, and I'm not. So, on either count. So, but it really, I think, is helpful when people say, what is it you're doing? To have an easy, catchy way to explain it and understand it. And it's also helpful because I think it's important. I'm a big believer in lineage. And that's one of the reasons I bring it up today, is that, you know, we're not just these people who meet in this room and pull stuff out of thin air and say, this seems like a great idea, but there's an organizing principle that hopefully grounds what we do. And that is rhymes. But before I get to that, I just wanted to point out in this Thich Nhat Hanh reading, when he said that about when you go to the mountain and practice alone, anger, jealousy, despair, you need other people. And this is exactly why, if you ever see people that have gone on like extended meditations, even in just a week, or if you've ever seen people who have been in a pretty isolated environment, it's like mental health units are like that. When they come out, they're overstimulated. Because you go to the meditation hall, and you know, it's sort of understood that nobody messes with you. You know, it's pretty quiet. And then they go home, and they're like, holy cow, everybody's trucking with me. and it's a hard adjustment. And there's some of us who are, like me, who are a little skeptical then about how well extended retreat transfers to daily life. I'm not saying there's not benefit to it, but I am saying that the longer you're away, the more there's this adjustment. And to me that means, are you bringing what you get there to the real world? The other thing I wanted to point out is Paul says in his reading, bless those who harass you, bless and don't curse them, which is why in the South, bless your heart means because they took that seriously. They figured out a way to do both, which is, not really. Anyway, Rhimes. Yeah, I didn't know until a couple of years ago when somebody from the South told me that bless your heart did not mean bless your heart. So R means radically inclusive. And when you start out being radically inclusive, in fact, I wrote a book about, a short manual about Rhimes that I'll have to bring and give away one day. It means radically inclusive, you start thinking about the obvious things. Ethnicity, ability, what we used to call handicap status, sexual orientation, and male-female gender roles. And so then, and that's kind of how I started thinking about it. And then you start to go along for a little bit. And then you start to think about things like illness status, addiction, and then this is kind of related to ability, but accessibility. What does it mean if you're trying to do a group like this and you're in a place that doesn't have an elevator? It means that some people won't be able to get to you. Now, of course, there's always going to be somebody who can't get to you. I mean, but you still, you have to do the best you can. And that was one of the things that came true for us in the UAC that we're going to talk about next week, is we had a meeting at a local hotel, and one of our folks needed a handicapped room, a handicap accessible room, and they assured her she would get one, and then she didn't. Well, that's not okay. And then, if you journey along a little more with radical accessibility, eventually you get to belief. Richard Rohr talks about how for most of the churches become a country club that looks for reasons to kind of flick you out the door. And most of the flicking, particularly interestingly in Catholic circles, and I want to say small c Catholic circles, which means Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, and Orthodox, is about belief. You don't believe the right things, you can't come here. But how can you be radically inclusive if you're going to set up hurdles around belief? Now, somebody says, I think it's a really good idea to go over the park and shoot people. You have to draw the line there and say, no, it's not a really good idea to go across the street to the park and shoot people. But that's really not what they're flicking as opposed to flipping people off for. It's you don't think the right thing about the Virgin Mary. You can't come here. You don't believe the right thing about was Jesus really the biological son of God. You can't come here. And so if you're going to be radically inclusive, you have to take a laxative around some of your sacred cows. Or do some, forget who it was that coined the phrase sacred cow tipping. Because you know in farm towns they tip cows. Here we tip sacred cows. You've done that?
Yeah.
Sorry to hear that. Sorry for the cow. But we tip sacred cows. It doesn't mean that you can't believe something really traditional. You can believe whatever you want. But what it does mean is that if somebody comes in the door and says, I believe in the flying spaghetti monster, you have to be willing to say, okay, come on in. And have that discussion, because something really neat happens in that discussion. Which is one of the reasons I was, and still consider myself, an Anglican. Anglicans believe that there's a real creative energy that comes out of people with different beliefs and viewpoints existing together in community. And that it can be a good thing and not a scary thing. H, heart-centered. Where does most of America operate? Where did every great spiritual teacher operate? So, interspiritual, and every great spiritual teacher. So if you want to look for another commonality, it's about the spiritual journey moving us from operating exclusively in our head to operating more in our heart. The great mystics all operated out of their heart. Now, it didn't mean they walked around doing stupid things, although in the eyes of the institution they sometimes did. It didn't mean they gave up their minds, but instead of looking at a problem, say, from a cost-benefit analysis, they might look at it and say, what's the most compassionate thing I can do here? That's heart-centered. they might look at it as if, okay, so Fred wants to come in here, but he walks on crutches. It's going to cost money to build a ramp, but it's the right compassionate thing to do, so we're going to do it. So we moved from the dollars and cents to the heart sense. I, interspiritual, that's pretty self-explanatory, but it's worth saying that our little sign on the door and the one downstairs says that we celebrate the commonalities of all the great traditions, spiritual traditions. That's what it is. It's not about saying, I don't know what I believe. See, that's what makes it. You know what happens when you cross a Jehovah's Witness and a Unitarian Universalist? You get someone who knocks on the door and isn't quite sure why. So, I'm going to lose my last two UU friends with that one.
Kind of like if you combine a Unitarian Universalist with a Ku Klux Klan member,
What?
the guy who burns a question mark on the front lawn.
Running right back up there. So there's a difference between looking at everything and saying that for myself, I can't make a choice about what I believe. It all has to be okay. And saying, looking at everything, and for myself, I can decide what I believe, but it's okay for you to decide something. Meditative. Meditative in the sense that it's not all about doing. The Rhimes little guidebook I published has the X in it. Remember the X-rated spirituality? And what are the one bar of the X is active versus contemplative. That we need to balance those things. And you can go to the soup kitchen and serve there 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you will be a crabby, burnt out person that nobody really wants to be around if you never walk away, have time to yourself, spend some time in quiet. It doesn't have to be formal meditation, but it has to be something where the stimuli are down. We needed more ultra wine today. Not for today, really, for probably next week and then next week. So we stopped at Pick and Save, and I went into the liquor department. And there was a guy in front of me, 2 people in front of me, who didn't have enough money, and I threw $1 at him. I didn't even throw it at him. But here, we've all been there. We've all been $1 short. And the clerk was like, thank you. Okay? And she was obviously kind of frazzled, and I think she had something wrong with her wrist because she had a brace on it, so probably the liquor department wasn't the best place to have her checking people out because everything's heavy. But, so I decided, because I can fix everything. Hi, how are you? I said, she said, you people are keeping me too busy. I said, well, I'm still trying to save it, because it's me. Maybe because there isn't a Packard game, so more people are coming in here a little later. Or maybe it's because there isn't a Packard game. And they're just drinking. Some things can't be saved. But she's obviously a little crispy and needs a day off. And that's okay, we all get there. So the M is meditative, that we don't get caught in that trap of doing all the time and spend some time doing some self-care, whatever that means for us. Now also, in our particular expression here, it also means being sometimes intentionally meditative. Sunday becomes that thing for everybody. So we meditate here and there's music. Wednesday and Thursday, it's most often quiet for people that want to take that M a little deeper, but you don't have to. It's just that you need to remember to care for yourself. E is engaged, as in engaged Buddhism, what Thich Nhat Hanh talked about. Where Thich Nhat Hanh recognized that during the war in Vietnam, it wasn't going to be enough just to sit there and meditate. That the society was screaming for something to be done. And it was very complex. And remember, in Vietnam, it wasn't just us, it was the French before us. So it was decades of war. And they started stepping out of the temple into the community to help people, and also to give the young men who didn't want to go into the army a place to be. Well, as you can imagine, that made them real popular with the government. And the North Vietnam didn't trust them because they thought they were working for the South Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese didn't trust them because they thought they were working for the North Vietnamese, and they really weren't working for either. They were trying to stop the war, so much so that in the case of Thich Nhat Hanh, two really interesting things happened. One is that Thomas Merton said, Thich Nhat Hanh is closer to me than any of my Christian brothers or sisters. And the second thing is that Martin Luther King Jr. nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize, although he didn't win. And then, because Thich Nhat Hanh came here to try and, during the war, to try and get America to stop, that really ticked off both the North and South Vietnamese, and he was actually exiled from his own country, and was first able to go back, just I think maybe about 3 years ago, he was able to go back for the first time. But he put himself on the line. Now, none of us in this room are likely to have the opportunity to influence international affairs, but maybe, who knows. But still, there's things in our local community that our spirituality doesn't become something that's locked in a particular place on Sunday morning, where somebody sticks a nozzle in us and fills us up with spiritual gasoline, and we go around the rest, putt around the rest of the week, literally, metaphorically, or in my case, both. But that that's right, I am carrying cans. I forget about that. but that that it means something in your community, whether your community means the folks that live next door, the people that live with you, that your spirituality takes you beyond the four walls of where you spend your time. And then there's the S. That's why it's Rhimes and not just rhyme, which is spiritual, but not religious. In the sense that nothing wrong with religion when religion is spiritual, but that the best way I can explain it now is that Marcus Borg distinction. Religion is humanity's attempt to control God, and spirituality is humanity's attempt to explain life. And the way that some religious folks try to control God is they write all these rules and say these are the rules that God operates by. And then when God seems to do something that isn't according to the rules, well, that can't be God that did that. So, evil, helping, what Tori said.
Oh, God.
Yeah, Tori, can't really, I don't know who's going to watch. Tori had a disagreement with her sperm donor's family, and last night, and one of her sperm donor's siblings or relatives tried to get into a fist fight with Tori, and Tori sent her a text this morning and says, God hates evil people. Well, no, but when you're, if we talk about that first half, second half that we spiritually evolve, when you're in your mid-20s and you're going to a Pentecostal church where they clap on the upbeat, that's appropriate developmentally. I mean, that's where you are. But it's a perfect example of, we set up the rules, what you need to do to get into heaven, and God operates by these rules, and when God doesn't, we go, get your shit together, God, because you're not acting the way you're supposed to, it must be Satan. But that's what religion does. It sometimes gets itself into that corner where those of us who have lived a little longer start to go, wait a minute, what you just said, God doesn't hate. So the spiritual journey is about getting from God hates evil people to wait a minute. Maybe it's not that way, and that's why there's an S at the end of Rhymes. So it's not meant to be a definition that just explains everything from A to Z. This is exactly how it all works. Thank God you found us, because we can give it to you. Because that would be our attempt to control God. But rather is this umbrella that says, here's a perspective. If God is that disco ball, and I really still love that metaphor, and each of those mirrors is a facet of the divine, this is the angle we're standing from to look at that disco ball. And because the ball spins, we're going to see a lot of different angles, but it's a different place. So what are you doing when you're being interspiritual? Well, you're being radically inclusive, you're being heart-centered, you're being interspiritual, of course, meditative, you're engaged with the world, and you're spiritual. You emphasize spirituality over religion. Now, religion, you can go to a religious church, and they might be very spiritual. You know, they might do tremendously spiritual things, and that's great when it happens that way. That's the ideal. But we're less concerned, we might say, with the usual outcome of religion, which are rules and explanations, than we are wisdom, which uses a metaphor that we talked about at the retreat, that Shri Ravi Shankara says that teachers impart knowledge or information, and gurus or spirituality is looking for wisdom, which is the outcome of information and a life well lived.
And what?
A life well lived. And by well lived, I mean, don't mean no problems, nothing goes wrong, but that you learn from that life. And so it's one thing to have the facts, and then you get to that disillusionary period where you realize that the facts don't quite work that way. You know, when I trained to be a nursing assistant, they told us how things were done, and if you did things the way they were done, your shift would never end. So then you talk to the people that were doing the job, and they taught you the shortcuts in the nursing home. That's the difference between information and wisdom. The way to get from the idea and then how it really works in practice. Which is one way to look at the goal of the whole spiritual journey. Not just the knowledge, but how does it play out in practice. Amen.